Okay, thanks for coming to my presentation. I have to say two things. First of all, I'm an old school Marxist that likes to talk about class, and you've been warned. Second of all, I was actually planning on, this is not based on any paper that I have written, it's just more like some kind of random thoughts put together. I was planning on doing this on, you know, obviously the current situation in the Ukraine, but I decided instead to focus on the experience of Syriza as a commonly perceived left populist formation in government and its foreign policy, which I think was not war as such, but definitely contributed to a kind of dynamic that potentially could lead to a war in the region. So I'm just going to start with actually a small anecdote. Well, not an anecdote, it's a story. So in early, Okay, so in early March 2015, the newly elected Greek Speaker of Parliament, Zoe Konstantopoulou, then a member of Syriza, paid a visit to Cyprus. During that visit, and in her official capacity, she laid a wreath on the graves of Kostas Misraoulis and Dervish Ali Kavazoglu, two Cypriot communists, one Greek, the other one Turk, that were murdered in the early 60s by right-wing Turkish paramilitaries. So this is both of them, and this is pictures from the annual commemoration march. And even though Misraoulis and Kavazoglu were killed by Turkish Cypriot extremists, their assassination has for decades functioned as a rallying point for all those on the island struggling for equality and peaceful Greek-Turkish coexistence. Accordingly, Konstantopoulou reiterated her support for Greek-Turkish political equality within the context of a future bizonal, bicommunal federation in Cyprus. What seemed like a quaint affair of state protocol was actually quite important in symbolic terms. It marked the most palpable Greek state recognition of Turkish Cypriot equality within the independent and nominally bicommunal, but essentially Greek-dominated Cypriot state. The Greek left, and especially its populist permutations in the 1980s, with Andreas Papandreou's pan-Hellenic socialist movement, PASOK, had been notoriously nationalistic. Their stance on the Cyprus, in their stance on the Cyprus question, but also on the general question of Greek-Turkish relations. Using his credentials as a fighter against the colonel's military regime, Papandreou's reign had helped rehabilitate Greek nationalism in Cyprus, which was dramatically discredited following the invasion of Cyprus in 1974 by Turkish troops, which was preceded, for those who don't know, by a Greek-sponsored coup that was used as a pretext for this invasion. Using neo-Marxist dependency theories, PASOK had constructed an antagonism between the Greek people on the one hand and the old right-wing pro-Western elites and their backers in the so-called imperialist centers on the other. The latter had always favored Turkey, according to PASOK's narrative, which had always been constructed therein as the so-called danger from the East. Now, a representative of the left populist Syriza was championing Greek-Turkish friendship, seemingly liberating a tradition of Greek left populism from its nationalist limitations. Konstantopoulou was not just any Syriza official. She was considered especially representative of a brand of citizenism within Syriza. On the one hand, she gained a faithful following by heading an inquiry into the incursion of odious debt by previous Greek governments. On the other hand, she championed social rights, such as those of women, sexual and ethnic minorities, as well as Greeks born to migrant parents. This is a picture of a very famous meeting she did in the early days of Syriza's government with children that had migrant parents, where, you know, as a state representative, you know, she did the big step of actually giving them a voice in the kind of imagery of the Greek people. Fast forward 4 years later, in early 2019, the same person, Konstantopoulou, becomes one of the most prominent spokeswomen of the movement against the signing of the so-called Prespes Agreement. This agreement changed the name of the Republic of Macedonia, Greece's neighbor to the north, into North Macedonia in exchange for facilitating the entrance of Greece's northern neighbor into NATO. In his failure to deliver on its promises to reverse austerity, Alexis Tsipras had viewed the resolution of the long-standing name dispute as part of a far more feasible program of social modernization based on, principles of, we could say, cosmopolitanism, liberal internationalism, and so forth. The movement against the Prespas agreements tilted overwhelmingly towards the right and the far right. However, it claimed popular legitimacy by enlisting figures associated with the left, such as the late composer Mikis Theodorakis and others. Konstantopoulou, who had left Syriza following the party's capitulation to the diktat of the so-called European institutions, became a prominent opponent of her agreement. Her small breakaway party called, in Greek, Plevsi Eleftherias, in English would be something like Sailing Towards Freedom, had emphasized the purported loss of national sovereignty inherent in the agreement. And incidentally, the party, which, it's a kind of a neither left nor right formation, also takes a very hardline stance on the so-called national questions. It is, for example, against the EU's agreement with Turkey on pushing back refugees, but not so much out of humanitarian concerns, but because, according to the party, it allows the Turkish authorities to enter into Greek territorial waters. So the case of, those are the pictures from the rallies against the Prespas agreement. So the case of Zoe Konstantopoulou is indicative of a quite prevalent question in the field of populism studies. How did a left champion of seemingly inclusive civic patriotism turn into a progressive fig leaf for some of the most reactionary tendencies in Greek society? And did this metamorphosis signal a break or some form of continuity with the initial populist moment? I would begin by saying that it would be quite unfair to consider Konstantopoulou as simply a nationalist aberration from the otherwise socially progressive and transnationally minded party she represented in parliament and from which she resigned in 2015. For despite the seemingly inclusive talk of a European front against austerity, Syriza under Alexis Tsipras had embarked on a policy that not only sought to ease regional tensions, but in essence further accentuated them. Syriza not only failed on its campaign promises of ending the Greek state's military cooperation to Israel, but presided over a massive expansion of military ties that also included providing Greek airspace for Israeli jets, practicing an eventual military strike on Iran. While it is easy to reduce this development to the coalition agreement between Syriza and the far-right independent Greeks, the reality is that the leading circle around Alexis Tsipras had a history of informal contacts to things like the US embassy or the Israeli embassy prior to coming to power. At the same time, installing the nationalist Nikos Kodias in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the independent Greek Panos Kamenos as Minister of Defense, have been interpreted as clear signs that the party was not going to disturb Greece's special relationship to the US. And Panos Kamenos, of course, of the independent Greeks was not just a populist, but he was also somebody deeply connected with the US and with the US military establishment. The reason, of course, for these moves was not some grand scheme of betrayal by Syriza, as many detractors have stated, but rather its attempts to gain the confidence of the Greek economic establishment it was vociferously attacking on the campaign trail, as well as the Greek military-industrial complex, or colloquially known as the deep state. The overall context was provided by the long-standing antagonism between the Greek state and its neighbor to the east, Turkey. But whereas 1980s Greek populists like Papandreou were using the discourse of third worldism, politically supporting movements like the PLO or having good relations to Libya under Gaddafi against the staunchly pro-Western Kemalist Turkey, now the group around Tsipras were exploiting the growing rift between Washington and Ankara to advance Greece's position as the US's foremost ally in the region. Thus, a government, and this is the irony, that was headed by a party that sprang out of the movement of the squares, was also aggressively courting the Sisi regime in Egypt, the gravedigger of the legacy of Tahrir Square. The intervention of Foreign Minister Kodias was even crucial in provoking the collapse of talks to resolve the Cyprus question in Switzerland in 2017, as he encouraged Greek Cypriots to raise maximalist claims, assure them of no heavy consequences in the case of the talks' collapse. So the experience of Syriza poses a number of obvious questions, both about the transnational potential as well as the national limitations of left populism. I drew a lot on a theoretical intervention by somebody called Heiskanen, I think he's Finnish, in a Journal of Political Ideologies, that talks a lot about what he describes as the nationalism-populism matrix. And I think it's a useful intervention because it invites us to conceptualize populism as a relatively autonomous, but populism and nationalism as relatively autonomous, but co-constitutive logics of contemporary politics, or as the author calls it, as both ideologies of the political that are very, very thin and are actually representative more of a certain logic in the functioning of the modern state rather than a concrete ideological program. So while nationalism's function consists of identifying who this sovereign people is supposed to be, thus solving democracy's boundary problem, populism is about representing the sovereign people in the place of power. While in the case of the former, the prime tensions revolve around the nation and the state, in the second case, the prime distinction is the opposition between the people and the elites. And these two sort of binaries synergize with each other because they complement each other in ways that allow the functioning of the modern nation state, whose prime characteristic is actually the fundamental division between state and civil society at the end. And also, quite important actually in this theorization of populism and nationalism is that there exists a certain gap of representation between the people and the elite on the one hand and the nation and the state. That means by definition, the people can never really become the regime. Their claim to be the authentic people and being the people is actually about more or less finding somebody that will represent them in the place of power, not about becoming the place of power in themselves. In more radical forms of populism, there is this sort of sense of immediacy that is actually being mobilized to reduce this gap of representation. And the same between the other binary between the nation and the state, we can say that the point here is that it can never be complete because there will never be a kind of a full 100% identification between a nation and a state, because those living within the state will not be, corresponding to the ideal of who should actually belong to that state. Now, I mean, I've talked a bit of theory here, and you're probably asking what this observation has to do with the experience of Syriza in power. Well, I believe that 3 points are here of utmost importance. First, I think the construction of an antagonism between the people and the elite, which was so crucial in bringing the party to power, ideologically also facilitated the controversial decision to enter a coalition with independent Greeks in the name of national unity. And it was, at the end of the day, a decision which I believe was ultimately guided by the upper hand that the electoral orientation of Syriza gained after after the elections of 2012, following, the upper hand it gained relative to its movement, its agenda that characterized it before 2012. Second, following the blatant failure to overthrow the austerity regime, the intimate discursive connections between the logics of populism and nationalism provided the Syriza-led government with an ideological fallback position following the dramatic turnaround policy following the resounding victory in the July 2015 referendum. Both Alexis Tsipras and Panos Kamenos, who appeared as, both as the two leaders leading the nation, declared that their decision was about their decision to accept everything that the Troika actually demanded, was about a patriotic duty, preferring to shoot their parties in the foot for the national interest. And this national interest was upheld in a double direction. On the one hand, against the local right and their backers in the European institutions, against the far left and its demands for a complete rupture with the Eurozone, which were deemed unrealistic. Third, the failure to overcome austerity signaled that Syriza was now being threatened by the same crisis of representation that has facilitated its rise to power. Syriza's promises were populist par excellence in their ambiguity, promising to end austerity and remaining within the Eurozone while providing no concrete plan on how to achieve this given the unfavorable balance of forces. Such demands were highly potent in their ability to rally a series of diverse and often contradictory demands and expectations. But in the failure to create new stable forms of representation against the corrupt establishment, it meant that the failure of Syriza actually exacerbated the already existing crisis of representation. Now, we'll just end a bit shorter by invoking another analysis made by two sociologists, the Ukrainian Volodymyr Ishchenko and the Russian Oleg Zhurlayev, that point out how this Maidan-type revolutions in the post-Soviet space that were actually guided by extremely thin forms of anti-corruption ideology by default failed to create stable alternative institutions to the ruling order, becoming susceptible to the influence of minoritarian, yet much strongly coherent ideologies, most notably neoliberalism and ethnic nationalism. And I think in the same way, we can say that the collapse of the anti-austerity paradigm in late 2015, Syriza and many of its discontents became more susceptible to the two prevalent default ideologies. And it wasn't just one ideology. Because on the one hand, we had the majority of the party accommodating to this idea of neoliberal governmentality, where everything that is left to do is to maybe modernize socially a bit and also administer austerity more humanely. And the discontents, people like Konstantopoulou, for instance, fell back to a diffuse nationalism framed around Greek victimhood and an equally diffuse anti-imperialism with more like nationalist and internationalist characteristics. And I think the overlying kind of assumption here is that the dissolution of classes within populist rhetoric function as a gateway drug for the ease in which those transformations took place, because both nationalism, ethnic nationalism, as well as neoliberal governmentality only recognize individuals as a kind of amorphous mass. And I would just end by saying, because I think I only have 1 minute, the whole point of this example was basically to express my opinion that I think that a pure discursive focus that views political antagonism as not determined by relations of social antagonism cannot explain the seemingly easy transition from a progressive European transnationalism or progressive national citizenism towards either a hard-nosed pursuit of the so-called national interest or a collapse into national popular chauvinism with oppositional characteristics. And I think that in this, it's the main kind of explanatory variable here is not so much one of betrayal, as the narrative became very known, but of the very fact that this government was actually, according to the tenets of populism as articulated by Chantal Mouffe, for example, was having a very clearly reformist strategy. And it was actually very honest about it at the end. And this reformist strategy actually also entailed making assurances to the so-called deep state that we will only focus on austerity and we will not, interfere with the functions. Hence the images like this ones, for instance, that had Tsipras meeting with Trump and being very reasonable, quote unquote, and advancing the so-called national interest. But I will just end it here and look forward to your comments and questions.